is that it's a leather book bound by metal, and even then it's intentionally mistitled sometimes to keep it hidden in plain sight. This idea of being able to read the Necronomicon without even knowing creates a whole new horror concept. The obsession of the Necronomicon outside of fiction that I mentioned at the start is no exaggeration. There have been and still are those who believe it to be real, and the number of hoaxes and strange stories over the years is quite astounding. Lovecraft often received letters from fans asking about the authenticity of the book, to which he assured them it was purely fictional. This didn't stop some individuals from listing the Necronomicon for sale in local bookstores, as well as creating entries for the book in library catalogues, even going as far to say the Vatican Library had a copy themselves. But most of this we can put down to light-hearted pranksters and some crazy people. As the obsession continued to grow, in 1970 a book by the name of Necronomicon was published by an author under the pseudonym of Simon. It would later be dubbed Simon Necronomicon. The book itself doesn't really link to Lovecraft's work, but instead claims that it was influenced and based on Sumerian mythology. This certainly blurred the lines between fiction and reality, with the book selling over 800,000 copies as of 2006. So it appears many of Lovecraft's fans were intrigued enough by the premise to read further. It could also be because the marketing for this book made some pretty outrageous claims, such as this book may be the most dangerous black book of the Western world. Regardless, its success meant that there were 3 additional volumes published, and I guess why not if people want it. The major success of Simon's Necronomicon led to the publishing of the Necronomicon Files in 1998, which aimed to finally prove that the book was in fact a work of fiction, examining not only just Simon's version of the Necronomicon, but the many obscure versions that followed in its success. Whether or not you believe the Necronomicon is real, I certainly understand the appeal of the book in a fictional setting, and why it would attract so many different types of people. Feel free to share your questions and thoughts with me in the comments below. As always, I've been your host, Mythology and Fiction Explained. Magic is something that we commonly see through all types of fiction and works of fantasy. Most of the time it provides us with a major plot device. It allows us to submerge ourselves in a world that feels familiar, but yet unique and fantastical. In works of fantasy and fiction, it's common to see magic described as light and dark, good and evil. There are acceptable practices and then those that are taboo. The subject of this video is necromancy, a practice that many classify as black magic or dark witchcraft, a school of magic that should not be practiced. But that wasn't always the case, and so today we'll take a look at some of the origins of necromancy, how it evolved and what examples we have today. Before we go any further, we first need to define necromancy. The term itself refers to a practice of magic that centers around communicating with the dead. This can involve summoning their spirit or even raising their entire body. As their spirit would no longer be considered part of our world, it's believed they would have access to the past, present, and future. Raising them physically is something we see from those who perhaps wish to bring a loved one back from their dead, or in some cases they're even used as a weapon to do the bidding of their master. The word itself originated from the Latin necromancy, which was taken from the Greek necromathia, or necromathia, which meant divination by the means of a dead body. And this takes us to some of the earliest accounts of necromancy, which took place in Greece and Rome, along with Egypt and Babylonia. These practices are often compared to shamanism, and there was no stigma or notion of wrongdoing when it came to necromancy, and this is something that came much later. There was a practice in ancient Greece called negia, or a nekia, which essentially was a rite or a ritual where the dead would be called upon to answer questions about the future. One of the earliest examples we have of this particular kind of necromancy comes from Homer's Odyssey, where we see the powerful sorceress Circe, who is capable of both raising and communing with the dead. Circe then teaches many of these spells to Odysseus, the hero of the story. She then advises him to travel to the underworld and to perform a Nekia in order to gather the information needed for him to safely return home. In Book 11 of Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus was instructed to raise the spirit of the blind prophet Tiresias, and this particular ritual is described in some detail. He must first light a fire in the dark of night, and then sacrifice animals whose blood would be given to the shades or spirits to drink. Whilst doing this, he would recite the incantations given to him by Circe. Odysseus encounters several spirits before seeing the prophet, the most noticeable of these being his mother, who he was shocked to see, because he believed that she was still alive. When Tiresias finally appears, he drinks the blood and begins to give Odysseus the information needed to make it home, first advising him not to eat the cattle of Apollo to avoid incurring his wrath. He also tells him that he will return home alone, with none of his crew. We can see from this particular example that necromancy wasn't seen as an evil form of magic, almost quite the opposite. This type of necromancy would be used by numerous Greek and Roman poets who would include these rituals in their stories. It became somewhat of a common trope for Greek and Roman heroes to perform a katabasis, a physical journey to the underworld that involved performing a task or a quest, in many cases communing with the dead. Those bringing the dead back to life were referred to as necromancers, and it seemed when it came to summoning one's body, they would mainly focus on those who had died recently, within a year or two. The rituals of necromancy did tend to vary. As we saw in Homer's Odyssey, they can be quite grotesque, involving animal sacrifice and sometimes even mutilation and consumption of the dead. Other times involves practices such as wearing the clothing of the deceased and consuming food such as blackened bread and unfermented grape juice, which was thought to symbolize the decay and lifelessness of death. It was fairly common practice to see artifacts such as talismans and wands used alongside these incantations. So when did necromancy become this dark art, this school of magic that was considered unacceptable or taboo? Most sources point towards the time period of medieval Europe. When the church really began to crack down on magic and witchcraft, necromancy was one of those practices to be condemned as dangerous. The church labelled the act of necromancy as maleficium, an act of witchcraft with the intention of doing harm. Necromancy would be equated to raising demons who hid under the guise of spirits. The church believed that resurrection itself was an act that could only be performed with the assistance of God. And interestingly enough, there were a number of clergy who did perform certain degrees of necromancy. These practitioners were almost always highly trained and educated in astrology, demonology, and exorcism, combining the Christian, Jewish, and Arabic teachings that centered around necromancy. Practitioners of necromancy, or necromancers, outlined 3 things they believed could be achieved through the practice: knowledge, illusion, and the ability to manipulate the will of others. These 3 things can all be seen in a positive and a negative light. It just comes down to where you stand. On one side you have the church, who believe those outside would use necromancy as a means to harm others and benefit themselves. Those who were not associated with the church saw it as an attempt to control and limit this form of magic, so that it would only benefit the church. Now, whether or not you believe these rituals and this particular school of magic is real is completely up to you. My stance on necromancy is pretty much the same as my stance on the supernatural and all sorts of myths and legends. I don't personally believe in these stories, but I believe they created and inspired interesting ideas and archetypes that we used and still use today in storytelling. And that segues nicely onto the next part of the video. Having discussed what necromancy is, where it came from, and how it's changed, we can now take a look at some more modern examples and how the archetype of a necromancer is used today. For those of you who have been watching this video and waiting for examples of necromancers, there are quite a few that appear in big franchises that you likely would have heard of or seen before. One that many of us would have come across in recent times is Tolkien's character Sauron, the Dark Lord who went by many titles, one of these of course being the Necromancer. Those who have watched the movies and maybe read some of the books may be wondering why he was given this title, because raising the dead isn't something we really see in any of the movies. However, in the History of Middle-earth, a series of volumes collected by Tolkien's son from all of his father's manuscripts, in Volume 10, Morgoth's Ring, we see a quote that tells us he is indeed capable of communing with the dead, enslaving them and harnessing their knowledge. If we take a look at the Mortal Kombat franchise, we have Shang Tsung and Quan Chi, who both assume roles of warlocks and sorcerers who dabble in the art of necromancy. In both their cases, they focus on raising the dead to form armies for their master, and ultimately do their bidding. Raising an army of undead is honestly something that we see from most necromancers. In Harry Potter we of course have Lord Voldemort, a wizard who did practice necromancy, raising an entire army of skeletons and zombies during the First Wizarding War, which consisted mostly of those he had already murdered. We also see something similar to this with the White Walkers and the Night King of Game of Thrones, who can raise the dead by simply lifting his arms. Now all of these examples so far definitely have evil intentions, and they are the villains of their respected stories. But as we've already seen, necromancy wasn't always considered a dark art, and not all necromancers are depicted as evil. We've already discussed the story of Odysseus, who is the hero of Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. If we take a look at the Marvel Universe and Black Panther in specific, T'Challa's sister Shuri has the ability to reanimate the dead, and she's no villain. We also have the rather interesting example of Dr. Frankenstein, who many consider to be a necromancer who certainly didn't have evil intent. I do find the case of Dr. Frankenstein to be quite strange, because technically you can argue that he did raise the dead, and therefore he qualifies as a necromancer, but I tend to look at him as more of a man of science, and his monster as a creation. So I guess we do have to ask ourselves, other than the influence of the church during the medieval period, why are so many necromancers in fiction evil? I think it comes down to the fact that they just make really good villains. When you defeat the villain's army, you expect the battle or the war to be over, but with necromancers, they're capable of summoning entire new armies from the corpses, given this feeling of hopelessness. They also have a level of knowledge obtained through communing with the dead that makes them more likely to command your enemy. And there is also this taboo when it comes to messing with the dead and just leaving them to rest in peace. Thus, the act of raising the dead can be seen as disrespectful and even evil in some cases. There are some aspects of necromancy that we don't always have to view through a lens of ill intent, such as communicating with the dead. I mean, sure, this is still an aspect that can be used in a negative way, but someone wanting closure for a close friend or a loved one is something that most of us can relate to. How you choose to view necromancy is ultimately your choice, but hopefully this video has been informative. I'm sure those of you who are unfamiliar with the necromancer archetype will start to notice it a lot more in your favourite stories. Feel free to share your favourite necromancers, or even just your thoughts with me in the comments below. As always, Mythology and Fiction Explained.
It's Mattress Firm's best Memorial Day sale ever. Save up to $500 on our best brands when you get a king bed for the price of a queen or a queen for a twin. Hurry into Mattress Firm. Restrictions apply. See store or mattressfirm.com for details.
With the previous video on necromancy piquing interest surrounding the different kinds of magic and how they appear in both classical and modern storytelling, it seems only fitting to devote a series to the exploration of magic and its many practices. Today's episode will focus on the art of divination, the ability to gain insight into future events through various different means and practices. Those who did watch the previous video on necromancy might be thinking this sounds quite similar to necromancy, and that's because there is some crossover in terms of being able to obtain information about the future. Where necromancy only really achieves this through communing with the spirits of those already passed, divination is a far more extensive practice of magic. In this video, we'll be examining the different aspects of divination, how it featured in past works of fiction, and how it still features today.
Hello?
Before we delve any deeper, just like necromancy, we should first establish what divination is, and the reasons for it being practiced in the first place.
Hi.
When we say divination, we essentially mean the act of seeking knowledge about the future and the unknown through supernatural means. As for the reasons why divination is practiced, I think the majority are quite self-explanatory. Being able to obtain knowledge and information that is usually not available is quite a useful talent to possess. Some may just want the comforting feeling that comes with knowing what lies ahead, and some may actively seek to change their future. The most common type of divination comes from interpreting different omens and signs. Sometimes these can be quite good, and then again they can also be quite bad.
Hello?
I'm sure many of us remember the divination scene in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. In this particular scene, Professor Trelawney is teaching the students the art of tessomancy, which in the Harry Potter universe is essentially the art of reading tea leaves to predict the future. The leaves in Harry's cup form a spectral dog known as the Grim, a symbol of death and an all-round bad omen. Now in the books, Harry's cup has more than just one symbol. Along with the Grim, we see a skull, meaning there is danger in one's path, a falcon, which represents a deadly foe, and a claw, which predicts an attack. These symbols do foreshadow future events that take place in the story, but they are all fairly vague, and we as an audience are left to put the pieces together and essentially predict the future. Now the term tessomancy may only really exist inside the realms of the Harry Potter wizarding world, but the practice of reading tea leaves and grounds of coffee has existed as a form of divination for centuries, and is often referred to as tasseomancy or tasseography. Tasseomancy only really began gaining popularity in the 17 and 1800s, and how far back it goes is quite hard to say. But if we consider the fact that tea itself was discovered thousands of years ago, then it's safe to say that it's a fairly old practice. Most historians seem to agree that it's an art that originated from ancient China, as it isn't something we really saw in Western cultures until Dutch merchants had established a trade route with China around the 17th century. Before then, we did see similar practices in medieval Europe, but often it involved the melting of wax and lead, or any other molten substance that would form unpredictable patterns that could then be studied. The process of reading tea leaves simply involves pouring a cup of unstrained tea. The cup would then be shaken well, and once the individual was done drinking the tea, any remaining liquid would be drained, and the pattern left behind would be examined. The diviner then interprets the patterns and links them to symbols that have meaning behind them. For example, if the leaves form something similar to a clover, that would mean good luck, happiness and prosperity is what awaits you in the future. Whereas a snake would be seen as a bad omen, and something like a mountain would imply a long journey ahead of you. There are tons of different symbols, and normally the fortune teller or the diviner would group them all together to create some kind of a prediction. Some of you, myself included, may have seen something similar, but instead using grounds of coffee. And this is something that is quite common in Greece, Serbia, Turkey, and various other countries in the Middle East. Similar to reading tea leaves, another very popular type of divination comes in the form of tarot. Now, not all decks of tarot cards were designed for the purpose of divination. In 15th century Europe, they were simply used as playing cards, and again it wasn't until the 18th century that tarot cards were really used as a form of divination, known as cartomancy, the art of reading cards to tell one's fortune. Cartomancy had existed since the 14th century, which was around the same time playing cards were first introduced into Europe. Much like tarot, each card in the deck had a specific value and meaning, but this entire process was streamlined when specific tarot decks were made for occult purposes, such as divination, and more specifically, fortune telling. They presented a much more visual experience. Drawing a 7 of spades and being told what it meant is slightly different than seeing tarot cards such as the Hanged Man, the Lovers, or the Fool. It just has a more supernatural feel, and I guess that means people represent. Growing up around this sort of stuff, I never really had a problem with any of it. I never believed it was real, and I still don't today. But I didn't see the problem of reading tea leaves or tarot cards or even having your palm read if it's done for entertainment or self-understanding and reflection. However, there will be certain people attracted to this type of divination that may be in a vulnerable position. They may have lost loved ones or gone through some kind of trauma, and rather than seeking the help they need, they turn to things such as tarot cards and palm reading for this false sense of comfort or clarity. And as with all things in life where these vulnerable people exist, there will always be those who attempt to take advantage of them. Now, this isn't me saying everyone who reads fortunes or practices divination is a con artist. I know people who do it for free and people who do it for fun. But it's worth being vigilant of yourself and the people around you when it comes to people telling you they can predict your future. For a small fee, of course. It's also worth mentioning that many tarot readers never make the claim they can predict your future.
Hello?
The cards are more of a guideline, and the reader is simply interpreting a possible outcome. There are countless forms of divination that each could honestly have entire videos devoted to them, so here's a quick list of the most popular that I haven't mentioned. Osteomancy, the reading of messages found in decaying bones. Scrying, the art of looking into reflective surfaces such as water or a crystal ball in the hopes of detecting messages. Numerology, the interpretation of numbers and dates, as well as the value and significance of letters. And lastly, rune casting, which many of you may have guessed from the name involves throwing runes and interpreting the position they land in. This was used by both the Celtic and Norse people. Now I say lastly only because I lost count of how many subcategories of divination actually exist, but feel free to Google methods of divination and count for yourself. Divination as a whole has appeared all across the world, from medieval Europe to ancient China and Western Africa. It was also a fairly large part of Mesoamerica and its religion. There are numerous deities associated with the practice of magic and sorcery. Tezcatlipoca was regarded as the patron of sorcery and a central deity in Aztec religion. Divination was practiced in the everyday life of the Aztec people through scrying surfaces, and through the use of hallucinogenic plants such as morning glory and peyote, visions were created that they believed to reflect the future. Now on to Greek mythology, where we see divination quite often. We have gods and goddesses such as Asteria, Koios, Apollo, and many more that are associated with prophecy. When we think of divination or prophecy within Greek mythology, it's natural to think of the oracles as the primary conduits of the gods and their prophecies. But in reality, this is something we see mostly from seers, who, unlike the oracles, had no direct contact with the gods or divine gift. Instead, they interpreted certain signs and symbols, mostly through the use of hepatomancy or extipacy, the reading of an animal's entrails, which is also another very popular form of divination, and one that we still commonly see. I'm sure most of you have read a story or watched a TV show or a movie where a character has used the entrails of an animal to perform some kind of ritual or spell that allows them to predict the future. Despite the oracles appearing in some of the most well-known Greek stories, they were actually quite rare, unlike the seers, which were much easier to contact. This abundance of seers meant they became quite valuable to the Greek people. So if seers didn't have the impossible schedule of an oracle, and they could both predict the future, then why have oracles in the first place? It's true that both oracles and seers can predict the future, but seers are far more limited because they have no connection to the supernatural. If you ask a seer whether you will die tomorrow, it will most likely result in a simple yes or no answer. But an oracle can tell you that at midnight, a man on a flying horse is going to drop a boulder on your head. Because seers have no connection to the gods or divine gift, they have to rely on interpreting different signs, which means they can only really give a yes or no answer. But this, coupled with the fact that they were often depicted as extremely wise individuals, means they can make a pretty well-informed guess as to what your future may be. The oracle's divination came from visions and messages from the gods, meaning they could provide a more detailed image of the future. Now, this isn't to say that one is better than the other, they're just not used in the same way. Seers may not provide a definitive answer, but they are readily available to most people, whereas oracles, as gifted as they are, were more so reserved for heroes or figures of greater importance or stature. So where do we see divination in works of fiction? Well, going by what we've discussed so far, it's pretty much everywhere. Any story you've read or movie you've watched that features some kind of prophecy is an example of divination being used. That prophecy would have come from some kind of oracle or prophet-like figure, and they would obtain the information through various forms of divination. Now, the whole prophecy trope is something we see all the time, and you could argue it's overused and cliché, but what it does do is provide an outline of a story or a key event in that story without really giving away too many details and spoon-feeding the reader. A prophecy can be self-fulfilling, or it can always change. If we look at Greek myth as an example, we have Uranus prophesizing that Cronus will be overthrown by his children, which ultimately results in him swallowing his own children and leading to a rebellion against him, contributing to his own downfall. And then you have Metis, who makes the same prediction about Zeus. But despite this prophecy, Zeus doesn't really change the way he behaves. He's still pretty much an overall dick to everybody. When that day does eventually come, when Zeus's children and the other gods stage a coup, there are far less individuals involved, and the coup is ultimately a failure, making it so that this specific prophecy does not come true. Some more popular examples that are a little bit more modern include Anakin Skywalker, who is prophesied to destroy the Sith and bring balance to the Force. But of course he ends up joining them instead, only to eventually turn on them anyway. You have Neo from The Matrix, who is prophesied as the hero who will destroy the machines and save all of humanity. But we soon learn that this prophecy is fake, and he is merely meant to reboot the Matrix. Though in the end, Neo does kind of save everyone, but it's at the cost of his own life and not in the way we first expected, very similar to Anakin. In Harry Potter, we have the prophecy that states that Harry and Voldemort cannot coexist, one would have to kill the other. Voldemort assumes killing Harry will end this prophecy, but in the end all it does is make him vulnerable, and eventually leads to the prophecy being fulfilled, but as the opposite of what Voldemort expected. Just from these few examples, we can see a pattern in how prophecy is used. Most prophecies in fiction never mean what the characters first think they mean. They act as somewhat of a diversion, taking you down one path for you to later realize it's the wrong path. Classic misdirection. Now, as for characters capable of divination in storytelling, that is something we see presented in a far different manner. A lot of this comes down to the very simple fact that being able to see into the future is extremely powerful, and if it's not implemented correctly, it can ruin a story and an audience's connection to a character. If you have a character that can use divination whenever they please and see as far forward as they want, you then have this problem of them never really being in any real danger. Nothing that happens really matters, because everything can be overcome and avoided. The way most writers combat this is by limiting the use of divination, and quite often magic in general. When you think of characters who have visions, they're quite often short and distorted. The character roughly knows where they are and what's happening, but the details are often left out. And that's why we commonly see this kind of divination occurring during dreams or nightmares. The character and audience have an idea of what's coming, but not enough to easily prevent what they've seen. Divination is a form of magic that has been practiced for thousands of years, if not more. It's appeared in some of our oldest recorded stories, and continues to be a staple of modern storytelling. Is divination a school of magic that you knew existed? And is it a school of magic that you believe in? Let me know in the comments below. As always, I've been your host, Mythology and Fiction Explained. The word magic means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It can be exciting, mysterious, helpful, and even evil. But the word itself is neither good nor bad, it merely describes a host of different practices and beliefs that elicit these emotional reactions. It really comes down to what you think magic is. Now, the term blood magic conjures negative imagery for most people, and that is understandable considering blood itself is a word that we associate with things such as war, death, and physical injury. Blood magic in turn is then also confused with human sacrifice and blood sacrifice, but that isn't necessarily what it always refers to. The entire notion of sacrificing humans and animals on altars with pentagrams and all that demonic stuff doesn't entirely represent the way it's practiced